Welcome to Introduction to Evidence Synthesis Methodologies. So there are 4 different methodologies that we are going to cover today. There are a lot more than just these 4. And so we will talk briefly about maybe what some of those are, but really we're going to focus on these 4 and what the differences are, what are the similarities, those kinds of things. But before we jump into that, see. Here, and just sort of generally what I'm planning on covering, sort of like a broad, what is evidence synthesis, these 4 types, and then some of the basics, the things that they have in common. Again, we can absolutely tweak this as we go, as questions come up. I am totally open to discussing other things as well during this workshop. So to get us started, I am curious, everyone who is here, how familiar you are with evidence synthesis. And so if you would like to pop it in the chat and let us know sort of your experience level, or if you would like to unmute and tell us about it, I would love to hear that as well. So it looks like there's at least some good understanding of the basics going on. And so what I'll do is I won't spend too much time on that then, so that we're not covering too many things that you already know. And we'll try to go with learning new things and things that are going to be most beneficial for you. So along with that, are there specific things? I know I said, that these are the things that I have planned, but is there anything specific that you would really like to get out of this workshop that we might want to add in? Any questions you have going in that I can make sure that I include as we go? Great. So a couple of things. So and Becky, I love this, like, the more that I learn about evidence synthesis, the more I learned that there are so many different definitions of it, and everybody seems to be talking about maybe something a little bit different. And so if you're not sure that what you're doing is evidence synthesis, that's pretty common. That's a pretty common thing, and the definitions vary across the board. So we're definitely going to talk about that a little bit. Learning about opportunities for grad students and postdocs related to training. So I am here at the libraries, at UNL Libraries. My focus is on evidence synthesis methodologies. And so I'm here, I'm doing a series of workshops on evidence synthesis. So there's going to be, this one will be repeated a little bit later in the semester. And then I'm also going to do one on comprehensive searching. I'm going to be focusing on the social sciences specifically. That's sort of my area that I've worked a lot with. Gabe, who is also in this workshop, is going to be doing one as well later this semester for the humanities. And then hopefully eventually we're going to branch out a little bit more into other disciplines as well. Yeah, hey, Gabe. But you can always send students our way. So we will do one-on-one consultations. We'll do more of these workshops. If you have grad students or postdocs that are working on a team together or just want to get together and invite us to come talk, we are absolutely happy to do those kinds of things. So there's a number of ways that we are happy to talk with doc students. Depending on how many, sometimes it is beneficial to get groups together and have me come talk to them as groups. But I work a lot on research teams as well. And so far, a lot of what I've been doing is one-on-one consultations or consultations by me joining a team and training the team as it goes along. That said, I am still pretty new to UNL, and so looking to branch out and make new connections and figure out the best ways to connect across campus to help with this training. And as we'll talk a little bit more about, evidence synthesis, and as I mentioned, definitions can vary. What we can help with at the libraries is we've got a good concept of the overall process, and the different methodologies and what might be best for the different kinds of projects that students or research teams might be working on. And then we have that specialization within the search strategy as well. The data collection piece is where we really excel. When it comes to the data analysis and data synthesis, I'm not sure what other resources we might have on campus, but I'm sure there are. And as we talk to people and develop those relationships, hopefully we'll be able to sort of help point people in the direction to sort of do those, because unfortunately, like the stats and the meta-analysis is not going to be quite my area of expertise. I can talk around it a little bit and give you the broad concepts and when it might be appropriate to do that. But as far as like more detailed guidance into that, we'll want to sort of like find other resources on campus. So is there anything else around that? So those opportunities that you would like to know, anyone? Okay. All right. And as I said, feel free to speak up at any point in time during this. I love having the conversations around this. So we will absolutely talk about PRISMA diagrams and procedures. And then of course, any other questions as we go, feel free to ask. So first, we are getting into that. What is evidence synthesis? And so I've got a video here, and actually, you can access these slides. Let me pop this link into the chat for you, so that you can access these. Okay, so there you go. Everything that all of the links and everything you can find attached to this this link right here. This should go to the slideshow that I'm showing. If you have any problems with accessing that or anything, let me know. Because there's a couple of things like this one. This is a video that's going to talk a little bit about evidence synthesis. I'm not going to play the video for this. So if you would like to go and get a little bit more information, I will say this is specifically a Cochrane video. And so this is defining evidence synthesis from a Cochrane medical perspective. And so that is the caveat. A lot of evidence synthesis and a lot of the definitions and a lot of the guidelines that you're going to find are going to be pretty specific for the health sciences. But as we know, evidence synthesis is growing hugely in so many different disciplines that there are various definitions out there. And sometimes what we mean when we say evidence synthesis can differ a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And what those things have in common, but just a very broad definition is all we're doing is we are combining information, we're combining the evidence, we're synthesizing it, right? And so then what does that look like? Usually what we're talking about with that is beyond just a regular literature review. We're talking about adding some kind of systematic component to it. We're talking about specific methodologies that might fall within that. And so there are a number of names that you might have heard. And this is one of those things too, is, just because somebody is using the term evidence synthesis doesn't mean everybody means the same thing, but also people might be using different terms, but also meaning the same thing. So that's a lot of what you're going to run into around evidence synthesis. So I wanted to point out a couple of these other terms: research synthesis, knowledge synthesis, information synthesis, and systematic reviews is often used as an umbrella term as well to talk about a family of different reviews within there. So I'm hoping not to leave you more confused after this workshop than less confused. But the more I dig into all of these terms and all of the different methodologies, there is a lot of sort of like confusion around the vocabulary and around what we mean when we're talking about this out there. So I want to prepare you and encourage you too, that if you're floating around and like, I'm not sure what these terms mean, that is, you're not alone. That is because there are a lot of different ways that people are defining these things. So there are a couple of review methodologies that are pretty consistently considered under this umbrella. So systematic reviews, scoping reviews, reviews of reviews, which are also sometimes called umbrella reviews, qualitative interpretive metasynthesis. That might just be a social work thing. I know that originated within the field of social work for the need for that qualitative piece. But there are always evolving methodologies that are trying to get at this systematic process as well. When it comes to quantitative data, the meta-analysis is the synthesis piece that is often tied in with systematic reviews. So when we're talking about these, this is another time when a lot of the terminology gets muddled, because there is the overall review process, and then there is the data analysis and synthesis process. And so sometimes people will use those terms interchangeably. And so especially when you have, grad students and postdocs coming to you and asking, what does this mean when I'm asked to do a meta-analysis? Or what does it mean when I'm asked to do a systematic review? We'll probably want to dig in and see who's doing the asking, what are their expectations around that, because they might be using a term and it might be used in different ways. And so the way that I want to break this down is the full review versus the synthesis methods. And some of these you can combine, right? So I would think, when you do a systematic review, I like to think of it as you can include a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis will be the quantitative data analysis piece. If you're dealing strictly with quantitative data, meta-analysis is usually the way that people will go. And so they will analyze the data that way. When it comes to qualitative data, there are many, many more methods for analyzing that data that might be incorporated into a systematic review or a scoping review or an umbrella review. Whether that's a meta-synthesis, content analysis, there's a whole bunch of different ways of synthesizing that data. And so that's the way I sort of want to frame what we're talking about. We're going to be talking today about the methodologies, right? So the whole process as opposed to just that synthesis process. That said, I do want to warn you that sometimes when people say they want to do a meta-analysis, they mean the whole process. So just putting that as that might be the way that you hear these terms used. So hopefully that sort of is less confusing and is sort of like encouraging about things. But one of the things that we're talking about with these methods and methodologies is the goals are to minimize bias, to increase transparency, reproducibility, and replicability. And so this really started sort of a push in the 70s to say, we really need more transparent and reproducible science. And so this has sort of like grown out of that movement. And so that is one of the things that all of these have in common is these are the goals of what we're trying to do. Regardless of what methodology we're using to get there, this is why we're doing this. And this is why the methods are designed in these ways. This is why you have to do that PRISMA diagram, right? Is so that we can be transparent about how we're going through the process. That's why these things exist. And then the purpose. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these developed within the health sciences. And because there's so much medical literature coming out all of the time, how do we keep clinicians up to date on all of those things? So they're not reading every paper that's coming out. They can say, okay, here's a systematic review and meta-analysis of all of the literature so that now I know, right? It's also a way of saying if we've got these two studies that are giving us different results for this this medication, this intervention, which one are we going to trust as a clinician? Well, if we're combining all of the data across all of the studies, that gets us that higher level of evidence to say, okay, we now have a little bit more confidence in the results because we've taken a look at all of these studies, not just a single study. Identifying gaps or trends in knowledge. This is one, we'll talk about this a little bit more, is a little bit more along the lines of like a scoping review, but that's sort of, just generally getting an idea of the breadth of the literature out there, what is out there. And then appraising quality of studies conducted to assess the strength of evidence. That sort of goes back into what I was saying about, is this drug actually effective? Is it not? This study says it is, this study says it's less so. So now that we've got all of these studies together and we're looking at all of the data, we can come to a better conclusion, synthesizing all of that available information. So these are sort of the reasons that we would conduct evidence synthesis. So now, getting into the types of reviews. As I mentioned, There's 4 that we're going to really get into today: systematic, scoping, rapid, and systematized. And then here are just a few of the others that we're not covering. And again, using that meta-analysis, as some people do, to mean the full methodology: critical reviews, umbrella reviews. Again, it's that reviews of reviews, realist, meta-narrative, meta-ethnographies, narrative, qualitative synthesis. All of these are different methodologies that you might hear. Some of them, when they're using these terms, they mean evidence synthesis. They mean that they want that fully systematic and fully transparent, fully reproducible methodology. Sometimes they're not. And so it's really helpful. Whenever anybody comes to me and says that they want to do one of these reviews, I'm always going to ask, what's the purpose? Why are you doing this? Which journal are you trying to publish in? And then let's go look at the guidelines of that journal and see if they're actually expecting a full methodology, or if they're expecting a literature review that has, a few of these components added to it. And so really digging into what you're wanting there. I have a few citations at the bottom of this slide that are some typologies that you might find more of these different methodologies listed within these. I didn't go through a full thing and list everything. These are the ones that I tend to see most often. So if you have any questions about any of these, your librarians are happy to talk through some of these and give you some good resources on these typologies and what some of the differences are. So let's jump into the most common one: systematic reviews. So gathering, assessing, and synthesizing all information or all available empirical research on a question. So we're trying to minimize bias here. Again, those goals. There is, within different disciplines, there are different expectations about how rigorous these are going to be. So within the health sciences, I've got, the Cochrane Handbook listed here as my source. That is going to be the Bible for anybody doing anything health related. It's going to be super rigorous. They've got a very strict definition of what a systematic review is and what it is not. A lot of times there's going to be a meta-analysis included, or at least some kind of quantitative data analysis that's also going to be systematic and rigorous in nature. Regardless of what discipline you're in, you want to really think through the full process before you get started. There might be sort of like fewer expectations in some of the other disciplines. I will say, in my experience with the social sciences and specifically social work, I get a lot of requests in social work. And that, I would say, like 5 years ago when I got started with this, there was not a broad understanding with journal editors, with just generally what the expectations are around systematic reviews and scoping reviews. And so you will see a lot of published literature within the social sciences that may be called systematic reviews. But now, if you tried to do that same sort of like that same methodology, if you tried to reproduce one of those and publish it 5 years later, I think the journal editors are going to say, this is not quite rigorous enough, right? There's greater understanding these days in a lot of disciplines about there needs to be more rigor, there needs to be more transparency throughout the process. And so I always recommend doing a protocol in advance. And that is one of those, if you're doing this in the health sciences, it's required. And sometimes it's required that you specifically register that protocol in Prospero. And Prospero is a platform for that kind of thing. And again, your librarians can talk to you. Do you need a protocol in advance? Do you need to register it in advance? Do you not? We're happy to talk with you through like what are the platforms that you can use. But regardless of whether it's required or not, I always highly, highly recommend it because it is going to go through the entire process in your brain in advance before you go through the process, so that it makes the process much easier when you're actually going through. Your whole team is on the same page as you're going through. It's just highly recommended that you do those things. But regardless of whether you're doing that protocol or not, you definitely want to have this clearly stated set of objectives upfront, predefined eligibility criteria. You want that to be explicit, reproducible, and transparent. And then again, what are your methods for identifying all of the studies? And again, that's where your librarian is going to be super, super helpful in building out. I like to think of search in 3 different stages. The first stage is your exploratory searching, and that is when you're writing that protocol, and that is, identifying what is the key literature that I would want to really make sure gets included. How am I going to define these eligibility criteria based on what the literature is? So you're really trying to get a good grasp on what the literature is before you're really conducting a systematic search. And I would say that systematic search is stage 2. And that is basically you've already developed that search. You've already got a really good idea of what's out there, but this is the strategy that you are going to implement, that you are going to report on in your manuscript. And then the third stage is going to be supplementary searching, and that is going to be hand searching journals. That is going to be looking within the citations of your included articles and looking at articles that have cited them. That's going to be all of those types of things that are just sort of like mopping up what might be missed within the databases that you're going to do your systematic search in. And then, of course, the reporting, the critical appraisal. Critical appraisal is one of those things that's probably going to differ by discipline as far as what your expectations are. Critical appraisal is really key within systematic reviews, especially in the health sciences, because you want to see, is this how, if this study is saying that this drug is very effective, and if this study is saying that it's not effective at all, I really want to critically appraise how that study was conducted. And then I might want to weight this one higher in my own analysis as opposed to this one, right? So that gets into that. How are you going to weight? How are you going to do the data analysis yourself on this based on the quality of the studies that you're taking a look at? And so that is less important in certain disciplines than it is in others. Very, very key, especially within the health sciences as you're going through those. Then there's different types of questions that are appropriate for a systematic review. And this is one of the things that your librarian will talk to you about as you're trying to decide, what type of review am I going to do? The type of question that you're asking is very key to what methodology you're going to use to answer that question. And so systematic reviews were designed for this first one. Is this intervention effective? That's really what they were designed for in the first place. Other types of questions that you can ask, how do these compare? These 2 interventions compare? What is the patient experience of that intervention? Prevalence is another big one. What is the prevalence of this specific condition or this thing that we're looking at, this phenomenon that we're looking at? How prevalent is it? The accuracy of a test or a measure, diagnostic accuracy, that is a huge thing that people will use systematic reviews for. Association between risk factor and outcome, prognosis of a condition, is a research method effective? So these are the types of questions. You'll notice that they are very narrow questions. They are very specific questions, because when you're trying to look at literally all of the literature on this, you need something that's very narrow in scope, as opposed to some of the other types of reviews that we'll talk about in a minute. So I want to pause here because I've done a lot of talking and this is a lot of information. So I want to see where you are, what questions you have for me about systematic reviews specifically, and everything that we've talked about so far. Okay, so moving on, we'll move on to scoping reviews. So I've worked primarily with the social sciences for the past 5 years. And I will say, whenever somebody comes to me in the social sciences saying they want to do a systematic review, I would say 95% of the time, what we end up doing is a scoping review instead. Within the social sciences, that seems to be much more of the types of questions that they are asking, and is going to be much more beneficial for just the types of research that we do in the social sciences. That said, we have done some great systematic reviews in the social sciences too, but it's definitely a question worth asking before you get started, before you take a look at all of your guidelines, is what am I really trying to do? And so scoping reviews are going to be much broader than systematic reviews. Like we were talking about, systematic reviews, very specific intervention. We're trying to look at, is it effective? With a scoping review, we're trying to get an idea of a couple of different things. We're trying to get an idea of like, just is there, a lot of times people will do a scoping review, is there enough literature to even do a systematic review? And so within a systematic review, that exploratory searching, a lot of that work is scoping review work. So is there enough literature to do a systematic review? What is the state of the literature on my topic? What are the trends within this particular phenomenon, this particular field? So what are the gaps in knowledge? That's a big one. So scoping reviews really help identify where the gaps are in the literature. So we're thinking much broader. We're not just thinking quantitative data. We're usually thinking mixed methods. And we're thinking much broader. So clarifying key concepts, definitions in the literature, identifying characteristics or factors related to concepts. These are the types of things that we're thinking about with scoping reviews. And I sort of got into this, but again, the types of questions that you're asking: what has been done? What are the gaps? What populations? Another thing is when systematic reviews are looking at a specific intervention, you might be asking, what are the interventions that are out there? And that would be a scoping review question. What interventions are there? And then maybe once you have an idea of what those interventions are, then maybe later on you want to do a systematic review to say, okay, now that I know what these interventions are, I want to hone in on this one, these two interventions, and see what's effective, which one's more effective than the other. So these are the types of things that we would do a scoping review for. And like I said, most of what I work with ends up being scoping reviews. And I think they're more fun. They're a little less rigorous generally, just because part of the process is discovering what's out there. With a systematic review, you really need to know in advance what is out there, because then you're doing the analysis on it. The scoping review is to see what's out there. So I still recommend doing a protocol in advance for a scoping review, just because, like I said, it really helps you think through the process in advance. It helps you keep your team all on the same page, but it's usually not required for scoping reviews if you're going to publish one. Still, it's helpful to think through, what are my eligibility criteria going to be? Within scoping review methodology, that can change based on what you're finding. It gets really frustrating and squidgy when that happens. That's happened a lot to me in scoping reviews, is we get into the literature and we're like, oh, okay, we need to change this eligibility criteria because this is the literature that we're finding. I would say it is expected, if that happens within a scoping review, that you're very transparent about that when you're writing up your manuscript. So your methods sections when you're doing systematic and scoping reviews are going to be really lengthy. And the goal is to make those as transparent as possible. And one of the things that I want to push as a librarian too is that systematic search. A lot of times what I see usually when people are reporting out their systematic or their scoping reviews, they'll say, we did a search with these particular keywords. If you're looking at the guidelines, the Cochrane guidelines, and even a lot of the expectations now within the social sciences, they really want you to actually copy and paste the search into your methods section. They want to say, I want to be able to reproduce the search exactly as you did it, right? So give me exactly your search string. And so as librarians, we will work a lot with you on building out that search string, not only to make it as comprehensive as possible, but also to make sure that it is reproducible, and that as you're putting it within the method section of your paper, somebody else can take that and run the search and get exactly the same results that you got. I went off on a rant there as a librarian, but so these are the types of things. But I'm going to pause here now that we've sort of like gone over scoping reviews. Any questions about scoping reviews, the difference between a systematic or a scoping review, and the expectations around those? Yeah, yeah, this is definitely something that I've talked a lot about, is sort of these differences and when you'll want to do one over the other. And a lot of times I'll hear people thinking that a scoping review is just a faster systematic review. And that is very much not the case. In fact, that's why we have rapid reviews and systematized reviews. And so sort of moving on to what is a rapid review? And a rapid review is something that I wouldn't say started when COVID started during the pandemic, but that's really when rapid reviews took off and when we were like, we maybe need some more guidelines around what a rapid review is, because we know that a systematic review takes a very long time. Publishing generally takes a very long time. And so when you have these emerging topics and you need a policy around something really quickly, that's when rapid reviews become much more common. And so there are guidelines around rapid reviews, but when you're thinking of a systematic review that is taking shortcuts and something to be done much quicker, that's going to be a rapid review. And so when it comes to going back to sort of like the types of questions, and I'll go back to that slide in a second, but like you're asking a lot of the same types of questions as a systematic review. Is this intervention effective? Sometimes there's some cost, some economics come into rapid reviews. They'll do rapid reviews for those types of things. But a lot of times the types of questions you're asking in a rapid review are going to be very similar to what you would ask in a systematic review. The difference is here you're taking shortcuts to get the information to people and decision makers as quickly as possible. And so then it's a balance of where am I taking these shortcuts and how am I explaining these shortcuts in a way that makes sense, right? I'm not just taking a shortcut just because I want to take a shortcut and I don't want to go the long way and do all of this work. It's like legitimately, I need to take this shortcut because of this reason. And this is a thing sort of across the board with all of these types of methodologies is, yes, you might have to have that protocol in advance, and people are going to expect you to stick really strictly with it. But there's the understanding that like things happen and things need to change. And so as long as you're very transparent about the changes that you make, there's forgiveness there. What happens is when you decide to make a change, but then you're not super clear about it, that's where authors get into trouble trying to publish and do those things. But generally, and especially with scoping reviews, because things change all the time, just being open and upfront about those kinds of things. And there are different ways that you can be transparent. I know with a lot of journals, there are some pretty strict, some really frustrating word limits there. And so when I'm doing these reviews, and I haven't done a lot of rapid reviews, I'm working on a rapid review right now. But I think what I'm going to do is push even more in rapid reviews for using an external data repository, something like Open Science Framework. UNL, we have a data repository here, and putting things, I always like to make available my full search strategies translated for each of the databases. And I'll put that in Open Science Framework usually. And then I'll put my PRISMA flow diagram in Open Science Framework because a lot of times they get detached, unfortunately, from your articles if they're supplementary materials when they get published, when they get moved around on the publisher's website, all of those things. So in my coding sheets, sometimes my RIS files with the actual search results after I've gone in and done my search, pulled that RIS file from the database, I will upload those into Open Science Framework as well. Just anything that I can do to be as transparent as possible, but not take up space in my manuscript. I'll use something like Open Science Framework to do that. And I'm happy to talk more one-on-one about the different platforms and what I would put in those because I work a lot with those. So absolutely happy to talk more about those. So as I mentioned, there's not really consensus here on which parts of the methodology should remain intact and which ones you can do shortcuts on. You should still really work to be as comprehensive as possible. I would say transparency, again, key. And I would say probably depending on what your question is, that might impact which parts of the methodology you take a shortcut on and which ones you don't, right? So lots of sort of like decisions based on the type of thing that you're doing. And then that's going to differ from a systematized review, only really very slightly. I would say systematized reviews usually are assignments, to be honest. They're usually assignments for PhD students. And usually they're called systematic reviews in those classes, but since a single student cannot do the full systematic review methodology in a semester, those tend to be systematized reviews. So we're learning parts of the methodology of the review process, and we're incorporating bits and pieces, but we can't do the full methodology for various reasons. Or sometimes maybe you'll be doing a literature review, a narrative review, and the peer reviewers will come back to you and say, we really need this search to be more comprehensive than it currently is, or, more transparent, or something along those lines. And then you're pulling bits and pieces from the methodology of a systematic review or a scoping review, and you're incorporating those into another type of review. I think this article that I cited here, Grant and Booth, I think they say specifically that this is a class assignment. This is not, I think it's the source, it might be a different source, but somewhere in there, they're very much like, no, this only exists as a class assignment. But you will hear people talking about them outside of that as well, but that's mostly where they come into play. And again, the types of answers or the types of questions it answers, really anything. These are just bits and pieces that you would incorporate into any other methodology that you would be looking at. And so this is just sort of a chart, and again, it's from that same article of just sort of all the things that we've talked about. What are the quick differences? So I won't go too much through this chart. You have access to it through these slides. But basically, this is just sort of going through a little more granularly what those differences are and how they vary. And there's a lot in there that's like, it depends on what you're doing. So that is there and available for you. If you have further questions on what type of review, Cornell actually has this really great resource, this really great decision tree to help you decide what type of review I'm actually wanting. And it goes much more in depth than just these 4 types of reviews. There's a number of different reviews that this will help you with. And there's other resources out there too. This is really one of the better ones that I found to help with that. But lots of typologies, lots of things exist out there. There's new and emerging methodologies all the time that you'll find. So break again for questions. So I talked about sort of the differences. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the similarities, what are some of the basics, the things that you'll want to be thinking about that these have in common. Also, I've got a resource here with just a list of tools through the process. And let me actually go ahead and I'll show you what this looks like. So this is a guide I put together. We've got our checklists and guidelines up here. Research questions. I will probably do a workshop at some point in the future on framing research questions because that tends to be a thing that it's super, super important for doing these. And I always take a long time talking about this when I'm consulting with people on how we're putting our research question together. But there's a number of different frameworks that you can use. So I've got those listed here along with their sources. And there's a couple more that I need to add. I haven't gotten quite around to that yet. And then some of the types of the platforms that I was talking about for registering protocols and, repositories. So Digital Commons is our institutional one, UNL here. And then there are a few other places. And I've got Open Science Framework here is the second one that I've got listed. I've got Prospero listed first, but the caveat with Prospero is it's only health sciences and it's only systematic reviews. It is the most commonly known, but it's much narrower in scope. And so I usually recommend Open Science Framework. That's the one I usually work with. Some management tools here, most of these cost money, but if you're doing systematic reviews, something like Covenants is worth that money to put into it. So yeah. So all of these are here. If you know of any tools that I don't have listed in this, let me know. I'm always finding new tools and adding them, and I would love to hear anything that you use. Covenants, yes. Oh my gosh, Covenants is a lifesaver so many times. Covenants is great. Distiller SR is a newer one that does a lot of the same things and looks like it's more customizable. I haven't played with it at all, but if anybody has any funds and wants to play around with Distiller SR, it looks very, very promising. I have a little bit of frustration with Covenants as far as its customizability. It's great for systematic reviews for health sciences. When you need to do a scoping review and you need to wiggle around some things a little bit more, it's less helpful. And their data extraction template and the way that you do data extraction and Covenants, I think, could use some help. But generally, it is great, and I've used Covenants pretty much. I'll work on systematic and scoping reviews if we don't have Covenants, but I'm really going to push for Covenants every time because it makes such a huge difference in the process. So glad to hear that that is being used. All right, let's go back to this. And then timeline. So as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a common misconception that a scoping review is a shorter systematic review, and just really that's not the case. And in my personal experience, I've had scoping reviews last significantly longer than systematic reviews because there's much more data that we're looking at because they're broader. But generally what I say is for a systematic or a scoping review, expect at least 1.5 years with at least 3 team members. Best practice for those things and really requirements, if you're in the health sciences doing a systematic review, they're going to say you need at least 3 team members. You can't really do the full methodology with fewer than that. So we've tried to put together a timeline here. We have Gabe to thank for this nice graphic, putting this together for us, of sort of like the time frame of what you can expect going in. Of course, nothing is ever that clean, right? We like to go in with those goals. It's never quite that clean, but definitely it's good to have in mind as you get started. So yeah, so you have access to that. I just wanted to give you a list of some of the guidelines as well as some of the types and some of the subject areas. So if you're in the health sciences, Cochrane's going to be your go-to, right? For some of the others, scoping reviews, I don't have this listed on there, but JBI, so the third one down in those guidelines, JBI chapter 11 in their manual is their chapter on scoping reviews. And that is, I think, becoming more and more the authoritative source for scoping reviews. And I do want to point out, so there are different types of guidelines over here. So my far right column over here, I've got them split up into conducting guidelines, reporting guidelines, and appraisal guidelines. And I think there's a lot of confusion between reporting and conducting guidelines. Because the reporting guidelines, so PRISMA is the one I'm sure everybody has heard of. That's where the PRISMA flow diagram comes from, all of those things. PRISMA is a reporting guideline. So that's really only talking about your manuscript, how you're writing things down. That's a guideline for the manuscript itself. For the process of conducting the review, that's when you want to go to Cochrane, JBI, Center for Reviews and Dissemination. That's what those guidelines are designed for. And so especially when you're writing up your methods section and you're telling them, what guidelines you used, it's helpful to be sort of clear on, we used, Cochrane or JBI, but then we're conforming to PRISMA's reporting guidelines as we're putting together this manuscript and sort of like helping clarify that. So those are available to you. PRISMA also has some great extensions. PRISMA has a scoping reviews extension that I point to all the time. It also has a protocol extension that is very, very helpful and walks you through the process of conducting a protocol. There's a newer one that's a search extension that's very good. It's very thorough. It's very robust. And we use those at the libraries for when we're putting together a search strategy. So lots of good stuff with PRISMA. It started out as just the single statement, and now there's a lot of those extensions that are super helpful out there. So general stages, you will see, so the seminal work for scoping reviews is Arksey and O'Malley, and I believe I have that cited earlier in here. If not, I can get that to you. They have scoping reviews broken out into 5 stages. They're very similar to this. I pulled this from a specific source, but you'll see sort of like different stages and steps in the process, but they all sort of break down to this same problem formulation. That's the protocol development, thinking through developing the search strategy. I add in problem formulation as you're putting your eligibility criteria, your research question together, all of those kinds of things. Then you've got your data collection, which is for a systematic and scoping review, that's implementing your search strategy, right? So that's going out and finding all of that literature. It's that systematic search and supplementary searching stage. Data evaluation, you're doing your deduplicating, you're doing your data extraction, you're doing your coding, your analysis, or your coding, all of that kind of thing. And then the analysis and interpretation. And then the presentation is you're writing up your report. I don't know of a better way of talking about these than stages, steps, but really there's so much that's like iterative, and it's not like you do the one, then you do the other. You got a lot of pieces working at the same time, but it's just a helpful framework to sort of think about it in these stages. And then this just sort of goes a little further into that. I don't want to talk too much about that. I know we're sort of running a little bit low on time, but just getting a little further. And then there's that source that I used, Cooper, down there for the sort of the stages in that process. Because that's looking way back before we had sort of some of these specific methodologies, when things were just sort of like getting started within evidence synthesis. That's how they were sort of like breaking it down. And then our PRISMA flow diagram. So as I mentioned, here we go, PRISMA, here's your general PRISMA statement. There are a couple of different templates. And also 2020, PRISMA updated everything. And so this is one of the PRISMA 2020 templates. And these you can download these from the PRISMA website, these templates, or you could also just Google PRISMA flow diagram template, and you can find a bunch of these. But with the 2020, they really want you to break it down much more than they did before 2020. So you want to have each of your databases listed with the number that you got from each individual database. They want you to be much more clear about your supplementary searching too. So your gray literature, they'll want you to keep track of that, what websites, what organizations, your citation searching, all of those, how many search results you found. And then, this is great. This walks you through the process. Covidence will do this for you. Another thing that Covidence is great at. I always tweak it because you're always doing other stuff on the side too, but so there's lots of great tools for helping you. And then what I do is, as far as reporting these, I will, add these as a figure or a table in the manuscript. I will also upload these to Open Science Framework or something like that. And then within the text of my methods section, I will, I'll basically say all of the same things. And then I'll say, you can see the PRISMA flow diagram to see, all of the numbers. And so yeah, even when you are looking at systematic reviews that have followed hardly any of the other guidelines, everybody does the PRISMA flow diagram, and that's one of those key pieces of transparency about how you went throughout the process. So did that answer the question for PRISMA flow diagram? Are there any other questions around that? Yes, thanks for bringing that up. And I would say, especially for scoping reviews. Scoping reviews are going to rely so much more on that gray literature than systematic reviews that are doing meta-analysis. I will say some systematic reviews that aren't necessarily just looking for quantitative data, gray literature is really important too. And it's one of those things, it's like, because the purpose of doing these reviews at all is to minimize bias. And then you've got that publication bias. So how are you getting around that publication bias? That gray literature is hugely important for that. And as well as like certain topics, when you're analyzing policies, you're not going to find a lot of that data in the databases in the peer-reviewed literature. You're going to find those on organizational websites and those kinds of things. Lots of data out there, yes, is very difficult to do systematically. And so when I'm talking about gray literature searching, we're talking much more about transparency than systematically searching it. But yeah. And I'll do like I mentioned earlier, I'll do a workshop on comprehensive searching. And depending on who comes, we may talk more or less about gray literature, but I'm always happy to talk about gray literature, and it's definitely a challenge. So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, and then just sort of thinking through librarian support. We are in the process of developing a service here. And so some of these may change a little bit, but this is the way that we're currently thinking about the ways that we're providing support, whether it's just, this is what we do as librarians, this uncredited, we're having one-on-one consultations, we're, if you are teaching a class and would like for us to come into the classroom and talk about this, happy to do that. Meeting with teams, all of those kinds of things, just getting an idea of the process. Absolutely happy to talk through all of those things. And then we are also happy to do some further engagement, whether that's sort of like at the acknowledged level, getting more into really helping you troubleshoot that search strategy, maybe even like posting some things in OSF for you, like doing some of those things, happy to do. I would say, honestly, most often, which unfortunately because of scaling won't be able to continue to be, I'm most often a co-author on reviews, and I'm happy to join review teams. Like I said, there's few librarians, so I think we're going to have to move a little bit more to some of these like uncredited and acknowledged levels of support. But librarians are really important in the process. And so whether you're able to get support from us or have that knowledge or are able to get it somewhere else, I think it's becoming more and more recognized that, the librarian skills are really important for that data collection piece, which is so key and critical to these methodologies. So absolutely reach out to us, depending on what our capacity is at any given time. We'll be really open with you about how much support we can provide. But we're continuing to develop out the service, continuing to develop out our levels of expertise. I've been very focused on the social sciences, but I'm pretty confident in helping a number of different areas. Gabe is going to be our humanities person. We've got more of a health sciences person. We've got a hard sciences person. And then of course, we're all helping each other at all times. So we got a number of those levels of expertise available and ready to talk to you. So absolutely reach out to us with any questions that you have at any point in time. So that is sort of what I've got for you here. Any other questions that I can answer before we go in the last minute or so?